From the hills, it was evident that there was another village in the distance. We asked the locals what was there. They replied that it was an old, abandoned village. There has been no sign of life there since the early 2000s. No one lives there anymore. And then, as usual, curiosity flared up in our veins. We got into the car and drove towards the village. There were no roads leading there. All paths were overgrown, but still, we managed to reach it. Hoping to find some abandoned belongings, we began searching through the houses. It wasn't right, of course, but no one needed it anyway. Yet peculiarities started emerging from the very first house. Covered in years of dust, the house looked haunting, but it didn't smell of dust and dampness. It smelled of decay, like from corpses. I, of course, had my doubts. Perhaps it was just my imagination. But as soon as I stepped into the kitchen, all doubts vanished. 2 completely decomposed corpses lay on the table. Rushing out of the house, I saw my friends, who were equally bewildered. It turned out that in the houses they had explored, too, there were corpses. We were already planning to investigate the houses together more thoroughly to figure out what had happened. As light flickered on in one of the houses, and someone's silhouette appeared at the window, we forgot all our courage, leaped into the car, and hit the gas. We never found out what it was, but it was clear to everyone that something was amiss in that village. As for the light in the window, I'm now inclined to think it was our imagination. Clearly, most of the few remaining inhabitants of the village perished at once, but we never managed to learn more about the place. At the border of the settlement lies a small cemetery, where a street begins, leading towards an abandoned village. At the end of that street stands a large, beautiful house with intricately painted shutters and big windows. But there's a catch. This house has long been abandoned, and nobody remembers who lived there. It seems that the owners, having just finished building this house for some unknown reason, decided to leave without ever getting acquainted with anyone. And despite the lack of care, this house remains untouched, with all its windows intact. It's a strange phenomenon considering the abundance of slingshot-wielding kids around. But the mystery lies in the history of this house, which, as you may have guessed, has attracted some supernatural presence. The story began in the mid-90s, and it sounds quite cliché. A group of 4 young high school boys, during the winter holiday season, decided to indulge in some light alcohol and fortune-telling. To do this, they chose to sneak into the abandoned house. They lit a fire in the stove and began to have fun, playing cards by candlelight. Suddenly, they heard someone entering the porch with creaking and loud footsteps, then silence. Adults. The boys thought in horror and froze in anticipation, but no one entered. Then the porch door creaked again, and the footsteps doubled. The creaky door kept opening again and again, the wooden floorboards creaking louder and louder, and it seemed like a crowd had gathered behind the door. And then, mustering up his courage, the bravest one, overcoming his paralysis, asked aloud, "Who's there?" But there was no response, only a faint grumble, and suddenly dozens of hands began pounding on the door. The boys stood in horror, watching the door, until the racket abruptly ceased. The door began to slowly open, and then the candles were extinguished by the wind. In terror, The boys rushed towards the door, hoping to escape. 3 of them dashed out onto the street, only to find nobody there. It was then they realized that they had been deceived by some dark force. Upon re-entering the house, they found the body of their 4th companion lying on the floor, his face frozen in a grimace of horror. Subsequent examination revealed that the poor fellow had died from a heart rupture. Since then, nobody dared to enter there, and children were strictly forbidden from approaching it. Residents still recount tales of seeing lights in the windows of that house, and some even claim to have heard sinister laughter emanating from within. It happened at the dacha of an acquaintance in a remote village many kilometers away from Ryazan. From there, it's about 40 kilometers through fields and forests to a certain abandoned village. Who abandoned it and why? I don't know. People just left from there when perestroika began. There's only one hunter living there. Well, not living, but he comes to relax during the day. He's a local gamekeeper, so he's supposed to know the whole forest. This gamekeeper is a friend of my acquaintance's grandfather. That's how we met him. He has taken us to this village many times. We used to shoot cans there and just stroll around. But at some point, he felt compelled to tell us, "Guys, don't stay here overnight." And of course, after such words, we had to stay. Besides, he didn't really answer any questions. He just said, "Don't need to, that's all." So, dozens of kilometers away from people. Not far from here are forests and swamps. By the way, sometimes at night eerie sounds can be heard from them. Anyone who knows such a little bird that makes graveyard-like sounds will understand what I mean. We're sitting in the house. There are 5 or 6 houses suitable for living, and one was arranged by the hunters. That's where we were. We had a double-barreled shotgun with us. We shot at cans during the day. Of course, there's no electricity in the house, only candles. We're sitting, playing cards by the window, and suddenly something flashed outside the window. My friend grabbed the double-barreled shotgun. I kicked open the door, and we jumped outside. We see a figure of a person not far from the house. It's dark, plus the forest. Visibility is poor. But the silhouette is huge, about 2 meters tall. Legs are not very distinguishable. Arms and head seem human, but no details can be made out. My friend aims the shotgun at him and orders him to identify himself or get lost. But the figure starts rapidly approaching us with some inhuman speed. Well, my friend's nerves couldn't handle it, and without much thought, he shoots at the guest with the double-barreled shotgun. Actually, shooting someone in a remote village isn't such a big deal. We bury him in the forest, and no one will ever know. The figure starts running away, and it feels like he's not walking but floating. Perhaps due to the darkness, we can't see his legs. While we were recovering, he quickly disappeared into the forest. It's impossible for a marksman of his caliber to miss from such a distance. The guy spent 7 years honing his skills, then officially retired, but he didn't give up his training. Then we got scared. Well, I got scared. My friend laid down to sleep on the stove and fell asleep fine, but I sat with the gun and kept watch until morning. By morning, we didn't find any tracks other than our own. It turned out that there are quite a few strange stories associated with these parts. After that night, I started to inquire. My friend's grandfather finally decided to tell us a couple of stories about the place where we decided to spend the night. He was a hunter, once ventured deep into the woods, and getting his bearings, realized that he was somewhere not far from that very village. He didn't feel like walking in the dark, so he wandered around the area, stumbled upon a swamp, walked a little further, and came out onto a clearing. There were trenches, craters, and pits. He remembered that there were battles between the Germans and partisans in those parts in the old days. It was winter, the wind was blowing, and the grandfather, without much thought, climbed into some pit. Later he realized it was a solitary grave or trench of some sort. He had his dog with him. He made a fire, ate, fed the dog, and went to sleep. He woke up at night to the sound of his dog barking. While he got up and reached for the flashlight in his backpack, the dog started barking even louder. Turning on the flashlight, he looked at the wall of the pit, and there was a worn-out boot sticking out of it, along with a piece of bone from that boot. The grandfather was terrified. He even forgot his backpack there. Only in the morning did he gather courage and return to the clearing. Everything was in its place, except for the dog. All that was left was fur, as if it had been shaved off, but there was no sign of the dog. In the end, the grandfather, afraid to descend into the pit, used a stick to retrieve his backpack, pulled it up, and quickly left.